Hello, I'm Stephen McInerney, Academic Director and Deputy CEO at the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation. Welcome to the next instalment in the Ramsay lecture series. For this instalment, I sat down for a discussion via video with Patrick Deneen, Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre, Indiana, and author of the hugely influential book, Why Liberalism Failed, a work that garnered international acclaim when it first appeared and which was identified as a major work by significant figures across the political spectrum, from the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán on the one hand to former US President Barack Obama on the other. I started by asking Patrick Deneen for his definition of liberalism. What is it? Where did it come from? And what series of political and cultural practices did it replace? I hope you enjoy the discussion.
Well, yeah, so thanks. First of all, thanks for having me, although I would have preferred to visit you down under. Was there several years ago, and I really enjoyed my time visiting there. So I think the first thing we need to establish is that the word liberal is an ancient word. It's not a word created in early modernity or of recent vintage. Of course, its roots are Roman, Latin in origin. It has a ancient Greek analog. It's a very old conception, and of course, it appears in the Bible, the Gospels. The truth shall set you free. We're familiar with this language and the word itself, but the word liberal in the more contemporary sense arises from a kind of philosophical revolution dating back to the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. That really reconceives what the idea of liberty is, in contrast to its classical antecedents. In the classical time, particularly if we think about its Greek, its Roman, and its biblical usage, freedom or liberty meant especially the condition of a kind of self-mastery, especially through the cultivation of virtues. The sorts of virtues either in the classical tradition, prudence, moderation, justice, or the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and charity. In the modern understanding, the inspiration of liberalism, the author, philosopher John Locke, they posit a definition of liberty that they argue is what one finds if one were to sort of imagine human beings in their natural state, in their natural condition. Of course, so famously, they suggest that we can imagine human beings in a state of nature, in a condition that precedes law, government, society, the formal creation of the sort of institutions of society that we would recognize. And in such a condition, both Hobbes and Locke describe human beings as naturally free, by which they both mean, and they both define it as a condition in which a human being can do as they wish. They can act or interact in whatever way they wish, free of the kind of obstacles or restraints that exist in the state of society. And this is the contrast with the state of nature. So I think this would have been a foreign concept to the classical and Christian thinkers, who understood that freedom was only achieved through a kind of cultivation. In other words, not merely a condition absent society and absent the institutions of politics and the political order, but rather as a kind of consequence of a good political order, or through the good formation of a human being, that was the condition of liberty. So liberalism, as I suggest, it posits a kind of form or an understanding of liberty that ultimately requires the transformation of all society in order for us to, as fully as possible, to achieve this condition in which we can act as we wish without the kind of external obstacles that might prevent us from acting in a condition absent or in the without the kind of barriers and obstacles to that modern form of freedom.
And does it emerge because of a dispute about the truth, the good? I mean, if the biblical notion of the truth will set you free, it presupposes that one can know the truth is it fair to say that liberalism, in a sense, posits initially that there's going to be disagreement about what the truth is, about what the good is, and therefore that those problems can't be resolved, and therefore we need people to be free to have their own version of truth, their own version of the good, and to pursue that to the best of their ability?
Well, of course, in the classical and even Christian tradition, the question and definition of what constitutes the good was highly contested, and it was recognized that it was a contested question. I mean, you only have to open the very first pages of Aristotle's Ethics and encounter there his recognition that people have long debated over the question of what constitutes the human good. But because there's disagreement over the question of the human good was not sufficient reason to therefore conclude we should therefore not seek to understand what the good is, and as best as we can answer that question, to shape and order human society, human politics around that understanding. So our understanding and ability to agree on what the nature of the good is has always been contested, and the philosophical tradition that endorsed that understanding always understood that it was going to be contested, and at some level, political society would always have to, sort of contend with differences over that question. I would say that liberalism was, in its own way, used, particularly used the occasion of what were some deep, deep divisions, especially in the Christian world, over the nature of the Bible, over the nature of understandings of the Gospels, over the institution of the church, all of the things we're familiar with in that history. But really used that historical moment to advance a kind of revolutionary philosophical doctrine that had, in addition to seeking, as many of its proponents claim, to assuage some of the divisions, nevertheless, actually, in a way, and this is one of the arguments of my book, in a sense, introduced its own alternative conception of the good, while claiming to deny that it was endorsing a conception of the good. In other words, while claiming to be above the fray and bracketing questions of the good, it actually, through this definition of what freedom was, to create such a human person, in other words, to liberate human beings from any limitations on the kind of project of self-making, it proposed an alternative conception of the good, even as it claimed to be putting a cessation to the debate that was raging at that time.
And what is the conception of the good that liberalism proposes?
Well, to return to where we began, the conception of the good is the free and liberated human being who is, in some senses, a self-making self. In other words, you could say a wholesale rejection, in particular, of the kind of political and social forms that prevailed during that time, which tended to define, extensively defined a human being in relationship to other human beings, in particular their family, and especially in an aristocratic age, one's status, one's rank, one's position in relationship to one's family's lineage, but of course also one's religion, one's geographic identity, where one was from. And if we think of the names that were dominant at that time, the surnames that were dominant, many of them were indicators of those very things. We can think of someone like Alexis de Tocqueville, for example. His name means that he's literally from a place and a family of Tocqueville, a place you can still visit in the west of France. Or the German name von, V-O-N, indicating either the place or the family that one is from. Or in the British tradition, it tended to be more one's profession. One was a smith or a weaver or a cooper. Those sort of classic WASP surnames of an earlier age. Or my own tradition, Irish tradition, you would be Callahan. You were the son of Callahan. All of these were indications that who one was in some senses in relationship to others. And one of the revolutionary forms of liberalism was to propose that who one is can only be ascertained and achieved to the greatest extent possible by liberating ourselves from any of those external forms of self-definition, and solely on the basis of what we ourselves make of ourselves and achieve for ourselves. So that's a conception of the good, in a sense, so this ideal of a kind of autonomous self-making self that has tended over time to shape an entire civilization, not just a politics where consent is that which legitimates government, but think of all of the social forms by which we have come to define ourselves. And increasingly, those require a kind of, the ambition or the project of making one's own self through the accumulation of one's decisions, for good and for ill. The accumulation of those decisions and the consequences are to be borne by you and seen as either the consequence of your good choices or, for those not so fortunate, of one's bad or poor choices.
Do you see any benefits to the liberal order, notwithstanding perhaps the questionable philosophical underpinnings? Have there been any benefits that you would like to retain for example, in a post-liberal order, things that we've gained from it that we should strive to keep?
Well, I think one can. I'll echo something that Tocqueville himself says, one of the thinkers I very much admire and have learned a great deal from. And Tocqueville recognizes that there were certain things that in the aristocratic age that aristocracies were very good at. And he has a very moving passage where he speaks of the kind of, he uses the image of a chain, that in an aristocratic age, everyone is linked together. So everyone from the king to the peasant is linked in a kind of a chain of relationships. And one could say that this transcends generations. It transcends time. That one is linked intergenerationally as well, so that one recognizes who one is through a kind of disposition of gratitude toward the past and a sense of obligation to future generations. And he said aristocracies are very good at fostering this kind of identity and this kind of sense of obligation. But one of its deleterious consequences is that it tends not to be just. In other words, that it tends to define who we are without, while precluding our own input into that identity. And so I'm fairly certain that in an aristocratic age, I would have been a mediocre potato picker in the west of Ireland, rather than a full tenured professor at the University of Notre Dame, one of the greatest universities in the world. So there's a way in which there's a certain a certain capacity for us to, under a liberal order, obviously, to ascend and to excel with the gifts that we've been given. And that's, Tocqueville recognizes that in a liberal democratic age, it will be more likely that we will find, discern the kinds of vocations that more closely cleave to the set of gifts that we happen to have been endowed with. But he recognizes also the costs and the downsides of this liberty, which is, you could say, precisely the opposite of what I just described as the strengths of aristocracy, the breaking of the chains. He describes this in a chapter called "Of Individualism in Democratic Times," so that people tend to see themselves solely as responsible for shaping and making their own lives, of bearing both the successes as well as the costs of the choices that one has made. And maybe even more poignantly, he writes of the loss of a sense of generational, sort of intergenerational obligation, a kind of self-regarding, narrowing conception of time, in which we become increasingly and narrowly focused on the present, to the exclusion of recognizing the sort of the debts that we bear from the past and the inheritance we're called to leave to the future. And if we can say that there's at least one significant challenge that we face as a modern civilization, I would have to say it's that loss of any intergenerational obligation that, informs so much of our contemporary politics and so much of our contemporary social disorder. If we think about the financial situation of the many nations of the West, the environmental situation of the nations of the West. So I suppose that every political system has its benefits and has its costs, but the accumulating costs today of liberalism are so high that I think whatever we retain from liberalism will have to be significantly balanced and corrected by something that perhaps follows it.
Let's stay on this question of the costs of liberalism. In the preface to your book, James Davison Hunter and John M. Owen summarise an idea that you explore in detail, that liberalism has failed to deliver on its promises, and I quote, to growing and increasingly mobilised and vocal numbers of people. And they describe some of its ailments: an increasing skew in the distribution of wealth, decay in traditional institutions from civic associations to labour unions to the family, a loss of trust in authority, political, religious, scientific, journalistic, and among citizens themselves, growing disillusionment with progress in effecting justice for all, above all perhaps the persistent and widening polarisation between those who want increasingly open and experimental societies and those who want to conserve various traditional institutions and practices. If you could, for us, I'd like you to unpack that. And to start, how has liberalism led to a loss of trust in authority? Might it not be the case that instead of a loss, there has occurred rather a shift of trust from, say, religion to science and from the family to the state?
It seems to me that it's inevitable that a political, social, economic order premised upon the achievement and realization of liberty in the manner in which I began describing requires, in fact, it's a fundamental requirement of that system, a loss of respect for or even identification of authority I think here again in the classical sense of that word, sort of institutions or persons that are regarded as vested with a kind of status or standing that in many ways with which we approach them with a sort of presumption of deference and recognition. It's precluded by the liberal order precisely because the conditions that are required for the liberation of the individual in turn require the diminishment of any of those institutions or persons to which one would give deference, presumptively give deference at least. That the kind of the flattening required of society, that no one is given a kind of position of presumptive authority, is precisely that which is required for the individual to experience the liberation of self. That's a kind of ground requirement of the liberal order. And those sort of alternative institutions that you suggest might be sources or venues of authority, it seems to me they suffer ultimately the same fate. Perhaps science might be one of the few remaining spheres where there might be some presumptive deference. But even there, I mean, I think certainly the experience of the last year with COVID, or I think even preceding that, debates over climate change, debates over many of the findings of contemporary science quickly become subject to the requirement and the inevitable consequence that the scientific findings alone don't suffice for us to know what to do once we have sort of arrived at those findings. In other words, there's always going to be a political requirement, the requirement of a political actor to take those scientific findings that might have grounding in a sort of objective empirical reality, but don't themselves tell you how to act once those findings had been discovered or rendered conclusive. And then one is in the situation position of whether or not the political authorities, the state, has the authority today that would in some ways be required for the kind of deference that we're speaking of. And there I would have to say it's just on its face, it's obvious, it should be obvious to all that the political order today does not enjoy that kind of authority. It did arguably in an earlier age. Certainly, I think in the United States, at least, during the kind of the era of World War II and in some of the years after World War II. But that did quickly erode as a kind of a sort of accelerating liberalism. Really did render views toward government increasingly suspect. People began to see government as increasingly a locus of corruption, of self-interested actors. And so in an interesting way, you could say a kind of self-contradiction of liberalism presented itself. One of the premises of liberalism is that we understand that we are, as human beings, we act based upon our interests. This is a kind of ground assumption that makes the liberal machine run. And it's certainly true in the ways we think about economics, right? Adam Smith, famously argues that it's out of self-interest and not out of benevolence that modern capitalist economics gains its fuel. But we could make, we could extend that analysis. How does that then apply to the political sphere? And increasingly, I would say that if there was a deference to the authority of public figures, it was a kind of remnant of an older tradition, a kind of Republican tradition or a classical tradition that had a deep, sort of steeped tradition of public service. Well, liberalism, in some senses, denies that there's any presumptive common good. There's just the sort of accumulation and aggregation of interests. And therefore, the political actors are only just one additional set of people who are acting based upon self-interest. So the presumptive claims of authority of the political order are ultimately undermined by liberalism, and I think is reflected in the sort of the deep mistrust one sees today among citizens of liberal democracies toward the political order itself.
I know this isn't something that you explore in depth in your book, but just your answer then has sort of made me wonder how liberalism might be connected to an earlier, as it were, dissolution of trust in authority, the Reformation, of course, centuries earlier. But your colleague at Notre Dame, Brad Gregory, has explored this in his work, The Unintended Reformation. But I wonder if this is part of the larger story.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't really given that a lot of thought. And I know Brad's book, but I'm trying to think of what sections would be especially relevant here. I think that there's certainly a degree of comparison to be made that there's no human institution that has ever existed that hasn't undergone periods of corruption, and sometimes fairly extensive levels of corruption. And the more power and wealth that accumulates in human institutions, the more likely we're to see corruption occurring. And I guess I would make the following contrast, which is that at least the philosophical and theological tradition of the classical period that is continued through Christendom and has a certain has influence in the Republican tradition that continues up through fairly modern times, understood that corruption inevitably occurs. There was just no question that human beings are prone to sinfulness in the Christian understanding or to vice in the classical understanding. And it's a very difficult thing to maintain the virtues of a people, especially in conditions that tend to invite corruption. But that the true corrective of that is to double down on calls for and exercise efforts to exercise forms of virtue, the cultivation of virtue, and in particular to seek to rejuvenate to whatever extent possible the a call for and practices that support the common good. The distinction I would say that we're facing today is that liberalism doesn't have that, in a sense, doesn't have that language, precisely because it denies that that's the deepest or ought to be the deepest motivation of the individual. The very premises of liberty, of the achievement of liberty under liberalism, in many ways require the dismantling of the idea that there's a common good and that institutions should be oriented toward the cultivation of certain kinds of virtue. So I think we're left with all of the types of corruption and vices that one would expect to see, especially. I have to think that today in the United States we're experiencing late imperial corruption in sort of a very advanced and accelerated form. But it's hard to see where the renewal comes from within the liberal order itself. And for that reason, the thesis of my book is not that liberalism failed because it failed to live up to its ambitions and to its goals. It failed precisely because it has achieved them. It's been successful in shaping a world in the image of its philosophical ambitions. And we're now left with the kind of costs of that success that are really just kind of almost inescapably surrounding us.
Yes, I'm keen, perhaps later in the interview, to explore what might be the possible program, if for want of a less technocratic sounding word, to respond to liberalism or to overcome its limitations, and what might be the something that we can strive for. I mean, you mentioned obviously striving to live virtuous lives, and which is hugely important, but it's very difficult to countenance a political project in the current moment that puts that front and center. But I'll come back to that. I want to just, if you would, explore for us a little bit a possible counter narrative, which is that the causes of some of the problems that you rightly identify might not be initially philosophical or political, but simply a consequence of technological development. And so Wendell Berry, who I know is a writer who's influenced your own thought, has shown forcefully how new technologies such as tractors, which replace a horse, have all sorts of effects on farming practices, on the wider community, and indeed on the environment. Cars and aeroplanes make it possible for people to leave their ancestral villages and towns and cities and countries to seek employment ever further afield, thus disrupting communities and giving rise, among much else, for example, to something you do explore, to the need for nursing homes, daycare centres and the like. Televisions, computers, smartphones have all contributed to the demise of family conversation and even the family meal, even before one considers the content of what people are watching or doing on these devices. Is this actually liberalism's fault, or simply an unintended consequence of technological development? In other words, to what extent can the dissolution of traditional institutions, the family farm, churches, labour unions and so on, be explained by developments in technology rather than by liberalism as such?
Yeah, I'm actually delighted you asked that question. There's a chapter in my book which is no one ever seems to want to talk about, and I actually think it's one of the more, to my mind, one of the more important arguments that I make, which is on the question of technology, and precisely seeks to explore this relationship. And while I would be the first to recognize the ways in which technology, in all the forms and myriad additional forms that you listed, have had a kind of have had a transformative effect on modern civilization. Um, what I especially wanted to stress in that chapter was the way in which those tools are likely to be used, particularly in a liberal order, to do precisely the things that you just described that they do. In other words, these technological tools in and of themselves do not necessarily lead to those kinds of conclusions. That like most tools, they are used in the ways that we wish to use those tools. Now, these particular set of tools might be able to be used in ways that really rapidly and in a dizzying way accelerate exactly the tendencies within liberalism. But those same tools in a political social order that are not in their first instance liberal would in fact could and might be used in very different ways that would not have the same effects or outcomes. So the argument I at least seek to make is that we tend to overlook the ways that a political order is itself a technology. Right? We tend to think of technology as tools, as little handheld devices, as the internet. But of course, technology from the ancient Greek word techne is anything that human beings make. And that includes, of course, all those kinds of tools. But of course, it also includes something like a political order. It doesn't spring from the ground like a weed. It's something that we construct, and it has a certain set of assumptions. And those assumptions, in turn, are going to shape how we, in turn, use the tools within the dominant assumptions of that particular political order. And that's why several times during the course of the book, I mentioned, just as a point of contrast, I mentioned the Amish as a contrast, and something that Wendell Berry himself does as well. Now, Berry will often make the argument that it's precisely in the denial of technology that the Amish have been able to retain a sense of community. And I actually think I differ with him on this. I think in many cases, I live very close. In many cases, you see them using a lot of forms of technology that we would recognize. I see them out there mowing their lawns with gas-powered lawnmowers, and some will drive cars. Many do not, but there are many forms of technology. For example, they'll use refrigerators and toasters. They just won't use electricity. They'll use propane to fuel them. But nevertheless, the order in which those tools are used emphasizes the centrality of the community, and no tool will be used either at all or will be used in such a way that's destructive of that community. So the predominant technology, which is the theology and political order of the Amish, orders and orients how those tools, how those technologies will in turn be used. So in other words, I want to resist the idea that there's a kind of an inevitability, a kind of determinism in our technology against which we are actually helpless, which has a kind of inherent and inevitable tendency. And wouldn't it be ironic if that were the position that people held, that this would be the outcome of a political, social, scientific order that claimed to be about freeing human beings? And that the irony and paradox of saying we're we're subjects to a kind of deterministic development of technology in order to become free is it's a contradiction that I think we at least ought to hope that it's not true.
Yeah, well, all of us who own a smartphone often feel that we're enslaved to it rather than freed by it. I think with its constant calls on our attention. So yeah, there is something, to the idea that we are enslaved to a large extent by these technologies. But as you say, I mean, if it's possible to, and it must be, to cultivate virtuous practices, then presumably that will then put those technologies in their correct place and allow us to use them in the best way.
Yeah, if I may, I actually think that's one of the ironic consequences of a liberal order, is that we are not equipped to really begin to have a discussion as a society of putting that technology in its proper place. And so the very freedom of self-definition that it undergirds this order, in a way, does ultimately subject us to this kind of enslavement, to the logic of these devices within the context of liberalism. And the irony is that, and maybe this sort of anticipates the question that you said you might want to ask me eventually, but in very important ways, we will have to move beyond these liberal presuppositions if we want to free ourselves from some of the baleful effects of these technologies.
Well, why don't we just stay on that then, since you brought us back to that point? I mean, obviously discussions like this and books like Why Liberalism Failed are part of the story about how we might move to something more that is more conducive to human flourishing. But what other means do you see to achieve that, to bring us back to a place where we can have these conversations where human flourishing is again something that people grow up believing that that they can achieve?
Well, I guess the first thing is I really I insist and resist that we use I insist that we do not use the language of going back. I think that in some ways automatically renders you, almost a somewhat irrelevant voice in contemporary debates. Not only because there's a sort of progressivist view that dominates intellectual conversations today, but there is no going back. There's no recreating some prior conditions. And I'm not criticizing you for using it. It's something that we all tend to use because we do at least recognize that there have been times in our own pasts and in past history where certain things have been better. But that said, I do think we need to understand that the past is there's a deposit of knowledge and wisdom there that we ought to avail of ourselves. And one of the things a progressivist age does tend to do is to be dismissive of the past as a potential source of wisdom or corrective. And there I do think, for those of us who grew up in a time without some of these technologies, to stay on that topic for a second, we can actually, we can still recall the experience of, spending time with our friends face to face as really the precondition of how you spent time with your friends. And it's something that watching my high school age daughter today, it's almost inconceivable for her that most of her interaction is now through this medium of the cell phone and social media. So it does seem to me that as we think about moving forward with all that we've experienced, both good and ill in our own times, that we seek to understand that which is worth retaining. Going back to an earlier conversation, I don't think anyone ought to be overly nostalgic about an aristocratic age where your name was your destiny. But at the same time, we ought to recognize that the costs of our liberation are so high that we need to rebuild or build in a new forms of relationality that it seems to me is a precondition of human flourishing. As Aristotle himself recognized, friendship is a fundamental requirement for human flourishing. And what are the conditions that are conducive to friendship? So I think a kind of an accounting, a genuine and serious accounting of the costs as well as the benefits of those things that we would want to retain and those things that have really exerted costs that are so high that I think they really do pose a threat to Western civilization. That's something that will be a successor to where we are now. And I don't know what it will be called. I hear people using the word post-liberalism. That seems to me to be that seems to me to be too referential to what it's not. It seems to me that it needs to be for something. And frankly, I wouldn't mind if it retained the word liberal, if we were to reinvest that with, let's say, an understanding of freedom that at least vested it with more of that classical understanding of freedom, that talked of freedom as in part the cultivation of the virtues that allow a kind of self-governance. And that would include how we interact with our technology. It would include how we think of ourselves in relationship to, it seems to me, the growing number of addictions that our society is incapable of confronting. Addictions, of course, of technology, addictions of drugs. We see the opioid addictions here in the US, addictions of pornography, addictions of all kinds that today we just simply see as forms of consumer choice that are ruining huge numbers of human lives. So I really do think that, unfortunately perhaps, but that it will be in as a consequence of a recognition of these accumulating costs that a successor form will emerge, as has tended always to be the case. In other words, people just don't think of new utopian political orders out of nothing. They are responses to something, and particularly dissatisfactions of present and current uh, um, arrangements that require a kind of response. And I'm actually fairly confident that human beings are inventive, and they will see the need sufficiently that will occur.
You mentioned the importance of friendship, and in your book also you talk about the benefits of stable family life and stable communities and so on. And you argue convincingly that what you call the new aristocrats actually benefit from many of these um, stabilizing forces in their lives, friendship and families and so on. Whereas people in, the poor, for example, seem to be affected disproportionately by changes to the view of the family and so on. Um, I'm wondering, and you mentioned pornography and drugs, and again, even though those things affect every class in society, they seem on the surface to have a more devastating effect the lower down the social strata you go. And I'm just wondering if um, you could explore that perhaps, and how is it that on the one hand people with certain prosperity benefit from institutions which nonetheless philosophically perhaps they don't typically defend or see the need to defend.
Yeah, yeah. This is an area and questions I've been thinking quite a lot about. I'm working on a follow up book that really focuses a lot on these issues, coming out of the last book. Um, so part of the argument that I make that you're referring to speaks of this of precisely where you ended, which is the a kind of a gap or a distance between the the formal stated commitments of this new aristocracy, the elite today, the sometimes the laptop class is a phrase I've been hearing more these days. The people who've tended to do well during the pandemic, um, that they enjoy the benefits often of relatively stable family life, and the kinds of social groups and interactions that seem to be really constitutive of a flourishing human life, while nevertheless holding the view that such institutions are at best optional. They should be regarded as, we should be indifferent toward whether these or other arrangements are better. And promoting more broadly a kind of popular culture and uh, journalism, media, and so forth that promote a kind of indifference toward these institutions that nevertheless they seem to enjoy. I think compounding this is that the institutions that especially the new aristocracy enjoys are largely, they are increasingly islands in a kind of sea of disconnection. They're portable units, and in many cases, the new aristocracies, one of their, an important feature is the ability to be mobile, to be able to move from place to place, move from job to job. One of the things I think you learn as a student in an elite institution is how to navigate the sort of a world of mobility in which one needs to be able to sort of set up shop, almost an entrepreneurial life in some ways. In other words, that this set of arrangements, this economic, social, and even political, requires a considerable dismantling of the thicker set of institutions, of which a family would, I think, at one time have been understood to simply be a part of, or in which membership in a soccer league, or the kinds of groups or clubs that people might belong to as part of an ecology of memberships. This, I think, has really, and a lot of social science evidence suggests that that these kinds of institutions and these kinds of memberships have really been largely eliminated or extensively eliminated from the lives of most human beings in the modern West. And it turns out that, in particular, I think if you have both the educational background as well as the wealth, that you can replace a lot of those, what were once, you could say, public utilities of relationality. You can replace them with sufficient wealth and sufficient educational preparation. The people who can't replace those public utilities of relationality are the people we see suffering, especially from the devastation of the inability to form families, the inability to maintain the kinds of flourishing lives amid a kind of wreckage of these shattered institutions. Now, many people in the elite class think that if we can only provide them with a similar amount of financial support or a comparable kind of position, but I think in my view, it seems to me it's a sort of self-serving argument that ends up maintaining the class advantages of the new aristocracy, uh, denying people the kind of public utility of relationality and the responsibility one has to those, even as a member of the upper class, while at least presenting a kind of concern uh, about the financial plight of people in this class that really never is, simply doesn't have a hope of ever being realized. There's simply not going to be um, a sufficient redistribution of wealth or equalization of economic opportunity in our world today to make up the difference. So I think that there's a way in which what we're seeing today is a kind of, I hesitate to say it, but a kind of self-serving uh, uh, set of arrangements that benefits people in the upper classes and allows them a certain kind of self-deception that they themselves are not complicit in the condition of those who are not prospering and flourishing in our society.
Thank you. I've just got two more questions, and I'm conscious of time, and especially your time being the evening over there. It's 3 years since Why Liberalism Failed appeared, and you finished writing the book 3 weeks before the election of Donald Trump in 2016. I wonder if you can reflect for us on whether or not the rise of Donald Trump and Trumpism more broadly can be explained as part of the failure of liberalism, and what the demise of Trump electorally, if not the demise of Trumpism, means for liberalism.
Yeah, when I was writing the book, and I should even mention that it wasn't only just 3 weeks before the election ended. The book in its main arguments was really the consequence of things I'd been thinking and writing for at least a decade. So it wasn't written in response to Donald Trump or to Brexit or to the rise of populism. And I think it was understood, and one of the reasons it ended up being in as many conversations as it was precisely because of those political consequences that we witnessed. And in fact, as I was thinking about this project, I didn't have much. I didn't anticipate that there would be the kind of political cataclysm that we've lived through the last few years. And oddly enough, this is going to sound strange, but it actually gave me, this political cataclysm gave me some hope, in the sense that um, the election of Trump in particular was not the solution. And I don't think, I don't think anyone would necessarily conclude it was the solution to the problem, and to many of the problems that I discuss in my book. But I think it was in some ways a kind of recognition, inchoate and inarticulate, among the broader electorate, that something was deeply wrong, and that neither of the mainstream political parties were addressing these problems. In other words, the elite classes that we were just discussing had more or less reneged on their responsibilities to be concerned with the fates of their fellow countrymen. And so Donald Trump was, in many ways, a kind of call for help, a really inarticulate one, an inarticulate person in many ways, but which I think, was certainly, at least had the potential of causing or prompting the elites in our society to reflect on really what had gone wrong. What had made their fellow countrymen so desperate that they thought that Donald Trump was the best option as president. Now, he himself, as a human being and as a political figure, clearly was not well suited for the position, and in many ways, I think, in my view, quite unfortunately, I think forestalled a serious self-reflection among especially the educated classes on exactly what had gone wrong. I've spent the last 4 years, touring around elite universities in which, nearly to a person, the conversations were always what a horrible person Donald Trump was and how we couldn't wait to get rid of him. And did we do anything to cause this? Have we been in any way complicit in this particular with this particular outcome? And I don't know that that's likely to happen in any near future. But it does seem to me that the conditions that led to the election of Donald Trump have not gone away. They're likely to continue to become exacerbated, certainly as long as the ruling class doesn't recognize its own complicity in this condition. And what has begun to happen is that a number of political leaders who I think are likely to be much more capable, much more articulate, and much more likely to forge policy that will constitute an alteration of the current trajectory, that these kinds of political figures are beginning to emerge on both the left and the right, as a consequence, I think, of liberalism's, the sort of elite of liberalism's unwillingness to reflect on exactly what has gone wrong. So in one sense, Donald Trump, to answer your question as directly as I can, Donald Trump was a reflection of the failure of liberalism, but I think also a kind of, at least the beginnings of what could be potentially a more constructive addressing of a new path forward that would require an alteration of our elite class away from its more self-serving qualities, away from its self-congratulatory belief that it has achieved its position through this project of self-making, and I would hope toward a greater sense of obligation and duty, especially to our countrymen of every race and of every background, who are struggling, I think, in the conditions that liberalism itself has created.
Thank you. And finally, I'd like us to turn to education. And again, you devote a chapter to this topic in your book. A huge part of our mission at the Ramsay Centre is to provide funding for the establishment of liberal arts and associated scholarship programs within our public universities in Australia. And we believe that without funding to allow for small group teaching of the classics, great works, in other words, of literature, history, philosophy, religion, politics, music, and art, that research-focused universities whose funding depends on, to a large extent, on research output and meeting various research metrics, that these will be unable to preserve the liberal arts tradition. As I say, you devote a chapter to this question on the relationship between liberalism and the demise of the liberal arts. So could you explore that for us? How has liberalism undermined liberal education?
Yeah, the other chapter that few people want to talk with me about, but I regard it as maybe the most important of the chapters of the book. So, I mean, to go back to the very first exchange that we had to discuss the meaning of the word liberty, the liberal arts, of course, are ancient. It comes from the ancient tradition of how one would educate a citizen, a free person. But more deeply, a liberal education is premised on the idea that one has to learn to be free, that one isn't born free, one doesn't accidentally become free. One has to actually be cultivated into a condition of freedom if we understand freedom to be the kind of hard learned discipline of self-rule. And that the self-rule, this condition of self-governance, is one that we're responsible to cultivate both as individuals, and we can think of this in how we comport ourselves in our lives, trying to cultivate the kinds of virtues that make us a human being that has the sort of virtues like moderation, of prudence, of liberality, of generosity, of decency, of civility, and so forth. But also that this is an essential requirement for citizenship, and hence why it's the ambition to educate someone in a liberal arts tradition is, of course, closely aligned with the ideal of citizenship, because one can't be a self-governing society without the cultivation of this ability to exchange ideas and to deliberate and reflect and judge, where prudence and good judgment are essential. If, however, liberty in the modern understanding is we understand as the condition of human beings that exist by nature before we are in human society, before we're in a political order, before we're in a civil setting and a social order, then education becomes really oriented to creating the ideal or the optimal conditions of the exercise of our choices without any obstacle or barrier. And in such a situation, the disciplines that will become most important will be the scientific and technological disciplines that roll back the limits that nature might impose on our freedom, as well as a redefinition of the humanities to let's say, a kind of an antipathy to the idea of a learned form of self-discipline, but rather humanities that become oriented toward a liberatory ambition and goal, and thereby end up in many ways canceling themselves because they run really contrary to the text and to the tradition that they themselves purport to be teaching. Right? So that Homer or Plato or Aristotle have to be understood as part of the liberatory project rather than as some of the most fundamental teachers of this more ancient ideal of self-governance. So what you just described, that what the Ramsay Center is doing, is precisely what would have to be done in a civilization that has a disordered or false understanding of what liberty is, which is that it will have to run against the grain of where the institutions will likely be going, given this definition of liberty that we've embraced. And I think it's precisely, and I laud the Ramsay Center for seeing precisely that without the cultivation of the liberal arts, there can be no recovery or future of an ideal of liberty that I think would better serve us, understood as a liberty of self-governing human beings endowed with the cultivation of certain virtues that we need as individuals, but I think even more desperately today, we need as political orders of self-governing communities.
Thank you, Professor Deneen. That's a great note, I think, on which to conclude the interview. I'm very grateful, and we at the Ramsay Centre are very grateful to you for giving up your time on I think it's a Thursday evening there at the end of, probably you've still got some teaching to do tomorrow perhaps, but coming to the end of a very busy week, no doubt. Thank you so much. I too look forward to the day when we can welcome you here in person. And so we're looking forward to that, and obviously all that will mean for what's happening in the world with the lifting of restrictions and all the rest, and the end of COVID. So thank you so much.
Amen.
Have a wonderful weekend, and we look forward to talking again sometime.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed that discussion with Patrick Deneen as much as I did. And we look forward to welcoming you next time to the next instalment in the Ramsay Lecture Series.